We are now going to move on to talk about ME and CFS, which is chronic fatigue syndrome. But this is to talk about more broadly how misdiagnosis and mistreatment of people with these disabilities and other disabilities has been reflected in society, and some of the work that Stef has been doing on this work. So let me introduce you to the background on the debate on ME, because there is a debate out there. And I go back to an article from The Guardian from a year ago, which is entitled ME and the Perils of Internet Activism. Research into the chronic illness, which affects 250,000 people in the UK, 250,000, may be stalling because of online criticism and abuse. The PACE trial was a landmark 2011 study published in The Lancet that examined the effects of various therapies on people suffering from ME and CFS. The trial became the subject of controversy for several reasons. One is that it looked at the ways of dealing with the symptoms of an illness rather than exploring a cure for a disease. Another is that it suggested there might be a psychological component to the manner in which sufferers experience the illness. And then finally, question marks were raised over the trial's methodology. In 2001, a survey of 400 GPs, 64% thought patients with MUS had psychiatric illnesses, and 84% thought they had personality problems. It is in that context that there is a heightened sensitivity to claims about the efficacy of psychological treatments. Essentially here, what we're talking about is physiological problems being diagnosed as psychological ones. And then I just want to do a little bit from the article here, which is that was recommended to me by Stef, which is moving on with the debate, which is recommendations made too nice. The recommendations in this draft guideline have been developed by an independent committee that was guided not just by the clinical evidence, but also by the experience and testimony of people with ME/CFS. The result is a guideline that will provide much needed clarity, set new standards for health professionals, and ensure that people with ME/CFS have access to the right care and support. Stef, do you think this is a fair assessment of what the NICE recommendations are? And can you explain them further? Why are they necessary? Why are these clarifications necessary, and these better recommendations necessary?
Yeah, that seems like a fair assessment. The clarifications are hugely important and really necessary, because for a long time, the recommendations have been that people should have cognitive behavioural therapy, which is basically trying to get people to think differently about their situation. The theory is that people with ME aren't physically ill, they're just mentally thinking about things the wrong way, and they're afraid of exercise and they're afraid of getting more ill, and therefore they're just perpetuating a situation in which they're not really doing anything, but they don't actually have a physical illness. So the idea of CBT is to teach them there's nothing actually physically wrong with them. If they just go out and do some exercise, return to normal activity, then they'll get better. And the other therapy is graded exercise therapy, which is a complement. It's again based on the assumption that it's a psychological, not physical problem. And it's basically just an exercise program. You find what you can do without making yourself more ill, and you gradually build up on that. Now, people with ME were saying this isn't working for us. Not only that, it's actually often actively harmful and makes us worse, because we don't actually have a psychological problem. We genuinely have a physical problem. So there's this big conflict between people with ME and associated illnesses that have the same sort of post-exertional illnesses that ME presents with. And this group of researchers who were saying it's predominantly a psychological issue. And they had a major trial in 2011 that the researchers said, look, we've shown that CBT and graded exercise therapy work. And then other researchers came in and said, actually, if you look at the data, that's not what you've shown. You've said that people have recovered from ME when they score themselves as having 60 out of 100 on a physical rating scheme, but that is very similar to someone with congestive heart failure who would score as 57, and it's less than what you needed to have to enter the trial, which was 65. So they were saying people had recovered from ME when actually these people were still really ill and were just as ill as people with congestive heart failure. And they also said that later on, they said that people with ME had improved their physical fitness, and because they, on a 6-minute walking trial, they'd increased at the start of the year from being able to walk 312 metres to the end of the year, they could walk 379 metres. So that's an increase of 67 metres. But that's still less than the average distance of 480 metres in 6 minutes. So again, these people aren't recovered, they're still really ill. And again, if you look at people with heart failure, if you give them a 3-week program of graded exercise therapy, then they can increase their walking by 141 metres. So someone with heart failure can increase their walking ability by twice as much as someone with ME, and they can do it in 3 weeks compared to a year. So the trial really wasn't showing that people had recovered from ME if they received CBT or graded exercise therapy. And the trial had also neglected to mention that some 31% of people had dropped out of graded exercise therapy, often because they'd got worse. So there was then several years of argument and acrimony between the people with ME and researchers who supported them and the researchers who'd engaged in this PACE trial. And we finally got to this point now where the guidance is coming out saying, actually, the official body in the UK has looked at all of the evidence from both sides, and they've agreed that CBT and graded exercise therapy aren't appropriate for people with ME. And this is a massive change around from the previous situation, and hopefully indicates that going into the future, ME will be taken more seriously, and there will be more research going into the physical underpinnings and less research going into psychological assumptions.
It just seems such a long time to reach this conclusion. It must have been such a struggle. What do these challenges what are the challenges really that ME and CFS strugglers face, not just medically but socially, and how do these challenges sort of reflect the ones that the broader disabled community face?
It's been a major problem that's quite common, particularly to women with chronic illnesses. So if you look back to the early 1900s, then multiple sclerosis, for example, was seen as women with hysteria, and men with MS were being diagnosed at far higher rates than women. So it used to be thought that MS, for example, was more common in men than it is in women. In fact, it's much more common in women, but the women tended to be dismissed as having hysteria, whereas the men were taken seriously. So this is all part of quite a common trend over hundreds of years, where in particular women, but also often just people with quite diffuse chronic illnesses that affect multiple parts of the body, are often dismissed by doctors and labelled as having psychological conditions rather than physical conditions. And as a consequence, research has either not happened or it's been misdirected, and treatment has not happened or it's been misdirected. So it's had a huge impact on medical science and on research. And it feeds into public perceptions. So the public will have a tendency to think if someone's got a chronic illness, perhaps they're faking, rather than appreciating what chronic illness actually is. So there was a recent programme by the BBC called The Real Deal. It was part of 4 15-minute films. And they presented it as being a genuine disabled person versus a faking disabled person. But actually the chronic illness community went, hang on a minute, the person you've presented as faking, you showed them as walking out their door with a walking stick, twirling it around in the air, walking fine, and then coming back sometime later leaning on their walking stick. So you're claiming they're faking. Actually, that's what chronic illness is. It's a reduced stamina for activity, reduced endurance, reduced capacity. So you start off fine, and then you lose capacity and you get more and more tired, you get more pain, you get more ill. So at the end, you can't do something. So yeah, if you've got chronic illness, you probably can walk out your door. Depends how severe it is. You might be able to walk 100 meters or 200 meters at a slow pace without using your walking stick. But after that, you get more and more tired and you have to start using this stick. And if you go too far, you get to the point where you can't walk any further and you're going to need to use a wheelchair. But if someone doesn't understand that what you've got is a chronic illness, it's really easy to look at you and say, you're a faker, which is what this program did. So there's that public impact, that public perceptions, where people don't tend to understand chronic illness. There's also been a major government impact, because the government had listened to these researchers who were saying things like ME or other medically unexplained symptoms. MUS just means we don't know what the physical issue is, so we're going to label it psychological. The government has listened to those researchers. So there were a couple of researchers associated with an American insurance company who came out in 2005 saying, we think some 75% of people on sickness benefits actually just have common health problems, and their main issue is they think they can't work, but actually they can. And if only someone just told them they could work, they'd magically get up and go to work, which is the similar principle to the CBT and GET. If only we told them they were fine, they'd be fine. So the government listened to that. This was obviously the Labour government. They brought in a new sickness benefit that was a lot tougher, that gave people less money, and also required a whole load of people to start engaging in work-related activity, even though they'd been found too sick to work. And it was all based on this idea that if only we told people they could work, then they would go out and get work, because it was this assumption that the main problem is psychological, not physical. But actually all the evidence we have is that it is physical. You know, if someone leaves benefits of their own accord, it's usually because they've got better, and those people go back to work. If someone leaves sickness benefits because they've been kicked off, because they've been assessed as fit for work, those people tend not to go back to work. They might claim job seekers allowance or now universal credit. They might appeal, they might wait a bit and then reclaim later. But largely what happens is they stay sick, they're just now unsupported by the state. And this is years of research. We've got an awful lot of research from Labour, because they were actually very good at doing research, even if they didn't listen to it. So we've got a lot of research from them saying people on sickness benefits have genuine illnesses, and that's what means they can't work. It's not a kind of flawed attitude, flawed belief, it's actual genuine illness. Less research from the Conservatives and Lib Dems since 2010, but still all the evidence is there. There are genuine health problems, and that's what is causing incapacity for work, and what you need is genuine health treatment. But because the governments have been listening to these groups who are saying it's about beliefs, it's about attitude, it's a moral defect, that's the benefit system we've got. And it doesn't work, it causes harm, when the point of the benefit system is to help. But because they've got these flawed beliefs about what the problem is, they've come up with the wrong solution, and they've caused harm rather than helping people.
Well, that leads me on to the last question I had for you before I bring in the others and just get a couple of comments from them as well, which is, what hopes do you have for the disabled community, especially in this arena, under this government? Because you say they're not listening to evidence, or they're not doing as much research, but it also strikes me that they seem to be politically and morally opposed in a way to actually helping pretty much the majority of society, but certainly the disabled community. Is that fair? And is there a hope that with this new research that public health bodies will be able to turn this thing around anyway? Or is there still a struggle ahead? And how can we help that?
I have hope from this decision by the National Institute to say that CBT and GET aren't appropriate. That is a step in the right direction. It's also a turning of direction. And obviously they're a big major body. They will have been talking with, there'll be in conversation with others, even if they don't necessarily make decisions based on what other bodies are saying, they will at least have been talking to them. So my hope is that this means that there are at least people at high levels who are starting to appreciate that all the assumptions they've had for years aren't correct, and that actually the situation is different. And if the situation is different, then different policies are required. I don't know how much change we can expect from the current government. I'm also not sure how much change we can expect from the Labour opposition. But I do think it's important to recognise that people on the right who think that it should be a small state and you should pull back and people should get themselves out of difficulty, get themselves out of poverty, get themselves out of illness. They're not doing that because they don't want to help people. they're doing it because they have flawed assumptions about what it is that people need in order to be helped. So if you genuinely believe that the main problem someone has is that they've got flawed ideas about their health and their capacity for work, or they genuinely are incapable of budgeting, or they genuinely don't know how to cook on a restricted diet, or they've just randomly chosen a criminal lifestyle for no reason at all, and if only they just stopped being a criminal, everything would be fine. You know, if your whole approach is that poverty and illness is primarily and initially because of people's decisions, then the policies that you're going to come up with are going to be about making people take better decisions. So it's not that you don't think these people should be helped, it's not that you don't have concern or compassion, it's just that because you've diagnosed a different problem, you're coming up with a different solution. So I think what we need is not to be going, oh, Tories don't care about poverty, or Tories don't care about sick or disabled people. It's to say, actually, they've got the Tories are the ones with the wrong beliefs and assumptions. And actually, we need to show with the evidence why it is that people on sickness benefits do have genuine health problems that reduce their capacity for work, and why it is that people are in poverty, that it is predominantly a structural issue. So a major one is, for example, if you look at employment, you know, since World War II, the governments for a long time pursued a policy of full employment, so they ensured everyone could get a job, there were enough jobs for everyone, so there was full employment. And then from the 1970s onwards, particularly the 1980s, you had people like Milton Friedman going, actually, we need to control inflation and hope that unemployment drops, rather than controlling employment and accepting that people can cope with inflation because people have job security. So it was when the government pulled away from full employment that unemployment shot up under Thatcher from 1 million to 3 million. We've never had full employment since. And as a consequence, if there aren't enough jobs for everyone, then there are going to be people who need unemployment benefits. And the government needs to recognise that you can't blame people for being unemployed if you as the government haven't ensured that there are enough jobs for everyone. So there needs to be, just more understanding from people on the right of what the actual problems are, in order that they can then use the compassion and concern that many of them do have, but put them into the right policies that actually help people.
Well, I think that's more compassionate than I would be, maybe. I'm just bringing Grace and Nick to maybe give a couple of quick comments themselves on what you've heard here, and whether any immediate thoughts come to mind. Certainly, Grace, I think there's potentially political solutions around rationally informing and doing research, but you've talked about building class power as well. What would you suggest from what you've heard there? Oh, and I think you're on mute as well, just before you do what I've done, which is oh, we've still got to get you off mute. Oh, if we can do that. Oh, Grace, I think you're still on mute. You didn't have your headphones in.
Okay, really long time to be talking while on mute. Sorry. I was talking too loudly to hear any of you. I know. So basically, I was just going to say a question about the kind of relationship between the disability movement and particularly the kind of post-crisis regeneration of the disabled people's movement with organisations like DPAC. How best to kind of integrate disability activism with the wider left, because I know that a lot of people I've spoken to who advocate on these things often feel like they are a kind of, side concern, and it's like, oh, we'll deal with everything to do with the economy and social policy and whatever. Oh, and by the way, there's also this issue around disability. So yeah, I'm just thinking what you think the wider left, whether that's the Labour movement, the Labour Party, social movements need to do to ensure that they are putting disabled people's voices at the front and centre of their campaigning.
I one of the things I put sort of towards the end of my book when I was writing about what we could do going into the future was that I think that actually if someone were to frame their policies around disabled people, you would have a society that worked for everyone. Because if you've got a society that thinks that you should be making sure that jobs are accessible to someone with a chronic illness who can only work limited hours and might need to work from home and work as and when they are able to, or if you're willing to make the physical adaptations at a workplace for someone, or if the government, for example, is willing to pay for British Sign Language interpreter, or if public transport is accessible, if there's reduced air pollution, if education is accessible to children with a wide range of illnesses or disabilities, all of these things mean that society would work for everyone. So I think it's really important for politicians to, instead of going, right, we're going to have this vision for society over here, and then we're going to see how we can shoehorn disabled people in, or which bits of that society we can claim are good for disabled people. If you should instead go, what society would work for people with illness or disability? What would work in making sure that workplaces are accessible? What would work in making sure that there is enough income for people who can't work, or for people who can work part-time or unpredictable hours but not enough to support themselves, so they need a top-up income? How do we make sure everyone can get around the entire country? How do we make sure that people have the internet access wherever they are in the country, or mobile phone access wherever they are in the country, so they can have those communication lines that allow them to work from home or allow them to talk to friends and family? How do we make sure that every child has a good start in life? How do we make sure that everyone's got a home that is warm and draft-free and mold-free, and the hallways and the doorways are wide enough for wheelchair access? If you can do all of that, then everyone can thrive, because if a disabled person or a person with chronic illness that can thrive, then everyone can. So I think if you start from what does someone with chronic illness or disability need in order to thrive in society, then you can build a society that everyone can access and everyone has the opportunity. And the really interesting thing, or ironic thing, I find is that obviously Conservatives talk a lot about equality of opportunity and that this is more important than equality of outcome. But I think they've perhaps not realised just how much government investment is needed to make sure that transport is accessible and available to everyone, education, healthcare, access to the countryside, access to the arts. If you make sure that everything is accessible to everyone, then everyone can thrive, and you need that level of state investment to make a really good foundation and the structures that people can build their lives around. That's when you've got a vision for the country that people can really gather around and support and say, yes, this is a coherent vision. It's not a series of random isolated policies, but it's a vision for society that works for everyone, and we can all get around it and support it.
That sounds bang on. Absolutely.